How great is your inheritance? The answer to this question naturally varies from person to person and from situation to situation. And undoubtedly, there are some in this room who are set to receive a vast inheritance, while others are set to receive nothing at all. But in today's culture, we're kind of trained to think about inheritance in material possessions. So take the Walton family for an example. According to Forbes.com, as of 2016, the Walton family, best known for Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, is considered to be the richest family in America. Forbes.com estimates the Walton family net worth to be approximately $130 billion. So when Sam Walton passed in 1992, the heirs to his inheritance naturally received a vast material inheritance. And while none of us would probably complain about receiving $130 billion, what we need to see is that not all inheritances of our material value. With this in mind, one interesting fact we will learn today is that God is a God who is interested in inheritance. The book of Joshua is about how God led the Israelites to reclaim the land that He originally promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. After 430 years of slavery in Egypt and 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites, now under the leadership of Joshua, were ready to claim the land that God had promised. The first 13 chapters of the book of Joshua recount how God faithfully led the Israelites to conquer the inhabitants of their promised land. Chapter 14 begins a description of how the promised land would be divided among the Israelites and serves as evidence of God fulfilling His promise to the nation. Today we enter the story in verse 6 of chapter 14 where we learn of the specific inheritance of a man named Caleb. And the first act of God that He takes in Caleb's inheritance account is that He promised Caleb's inheritance. Let's look starting in verse 6. It says, "Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, 'You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses the servant of the Lord sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word again as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God.'" Now what Caleb does here is he recounts to Joshua the events of Numbers 13 and 14. And he makes a contrast between he and Joshua and the other 10 of the 12 spies that were sent into the land of Canaan. He and Joshua remained faithful to God. 10 of the 12 turned the hearts of the people away from God. But what we need to see is the description of Caleb in here twice in this section and several times in Numbers is that he wholly followed the Lord his God. The original language kind of literally translates out is that he was filling completely after, kind of the idea that he was chasing after God with everything that he had. And I picture it this way. When I was younger, I used to walk directly behind my dad. And I wouldn't look necessarily to the right or to the left. I really wouldn't even look where I was going. Instead, I would try to place my foot exactly in the same spot that my dad's left off. Any of y'all ever done that with your dad when you were younger? And see, I did that because I didn't have to know where I was going. Because as long as I stepped my step in the step of my dad, I trusted that my dad knew where he was going. In the same way that I stepped in the step of my dad, Caleb stepped in the step of God. When the rest of the nation of Israel had their hearts turned away from him, Caleb wholly followed the Lord. And because of this, we see that God promised him an inheritance in the land of Canaan. The second act God takes in Caleb's inheritance account is that he prepared Caleb's inheritance. Let's continue in verse 10 as Caleb says, "And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as He said these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength as my strength was then for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said. And what we see with Caleb's preparation is that it was twofold. First, we see that God prepared Canaan. The first 13 chapters of the book of Joshua recount how when the nation of Israel remained faithful to God, they were victorious in battle. And when they were not faithful to God, they were defeated in battle. And so finally, the nation's heart was in tune to God's, just as Caleb's always had been. And therefore, the nation of Israel blazed through the land of Canaan in victory. Therefore, God prepared Canaan. But we also see that God prepared Caleb as well. We see in the text that He prepared him physically. 45 years had passed since the original promise given to Caleb. He was 85 years old. And what does he say of himself? He said, man, I'm still ready to go reclaim and take the land that God has always promised to be mine. It doesn't matter that I'm 85 years old. It doesn't matter that it's been 45 years since the original promise. I am still ready as I was then. I am ready now. We also see that God prepared him mentally. This is a man that just spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness for a lack of faith that was not even his. And instead of losing heart, he's still ready. He's still prepared. We see that God's preparation was not only Canaan for Caleb, but also Caleb for Canaan, as He preserved him in the wilderness for those 40 years. The third act God takes in Caleb's inheritance account is that He presented Caleb's inheritance. Verse 13, then Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite to this day. Why? Because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. Verses 13 and 14 kind of act as like a literary resolution to this scene, this act in Joshua 14. And we see that God presented Caleb an inheritance because back, like we saw in the first verses 6 through 9, is because he wholly followed the Lord. But while Caleb is kind of one of the main characters in the chapter, this chapter isn't just about Caleb. This chapter is the allotment of the land for the whole nation of Israel. So we see that not only when Caleb wholly followed the Lord, that he was presented an inheritance, but we see when Israel wholly followed the Lord, they received their promised inheritance in the land of Canaan. But really, if we go even further back, we see that this chapter is not actually about Caleb or Israel at all. The main character, the one doing the action, is God. He is the one that is initiating the action. He is the one promising, preparing, and presenting. It is God who is the main character. And what we need to learn from this story today is that God is a God who is faithful to bring about the promises that He gives. God grants an inheritance to those who have faith in Him. God grants an inheritance to those who have faith in Him. Now, why should this matter to us? Why is it important for us to understand this story from some 3,000 years ago? Well, it's important for us to understand because, like Caleb, God has promised and prepared an inheritance to you as well. In Genesis chapter 3, after the first sin of Adam and Eve, God made a covenant promise to all mankind. God had every right to forsake us forever. However, He did something different. On that day, God declared that He would restore His relationship with us. So God didn't forsake us, but instead, He wrote Himself into our own redemption story. God promised our inheritance. He knew we could not get back to Him on our own, so He came to us. God, in the form of Jesus Christ, left the glory of heaven and came to earth. And while on earth, He lived as we do, yet He never sinned. He was fully man, but also fully God. Eventually, though, our love for Jesus turned to hate, and although He never sinned, we crucified Him on the cross. Thankfully, though, the story doesn't end there, because 3 days after Jesus was crucified on the cross, He rose again, defeating sin and death in the process. He lived then, and He is still alive today. And through Jesus' death and resurrection, God made a way for us to be reunited with Him. So God prepared our inheritance. But now, just like Caleb, we must respond to God in faith if we are to receive our inheritance. For those of us who do, we will not fully receive our promised inheritance until we die and are fully reunited with God. However, when we respond in faith, God presents us an advance on our inheritance through the pouring out of His Spirit on our lives. Ephesians 1:13 and 14 tells us like this. It says, "In Him you also, when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation, and believed in Him, were sealed with the promised Holy Spirit, who is the guarantee of our inheritance until we acquire possession of it, to the praise of His glory." So, in Joshua 14, we see that God granted Caleb an inheritance in Canaan because he wholly followed the Lord. From this, we learn that God grants an inheritance to those who have faith in Him. For us, God grants us an inheritance of being reunited with Him when we respond in faith to Jesus' actions on the cross and in the grave. So the question is very simple. Have you responded to God in faith? And if not, will you?